Welcome to Hope Network Ministries webinar. I'm Grady King, Executive Director of Hope Network. And our topic today with my friend Landon Self is what church leaders need to know about trauma. But before we get there, Landon, tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you're a licensed professional counselor, and what's your interest in trauma? Just tell us a little background.
Yeah. So I've been a licensed professional counselor in the field of counseling for 13 years at this point, and started at a psychiatric hospital where I was working with people with depression, anxiety, ended up meeting a lot of people with trauma. So while trauma was never something I thought would become my niche, it did. I got to witness several very experienced therapists do some good trauma resolution type work with clients where I could see them really grow and benefit. And that moved me into this idea of like, all right, I've got to pursue that training so I can make sure I can dig deep with people to do really good healing work. And so I do some trauma focused groups every week at that psychiatric hospital still, but otherwise I'm in private practice working with individuals and occasionally a couple.
Wow, that's great. Well, when I met you over a year ago, I was fascinated by the kind of work you do and
Hmm.
fascinated by the need. We hear about the word trauma a lot.
Yeah.
It seems to be vogue. COVID was trauma. There's all kinds of trauma going on in places. And, church leaders typically, we're not really schooled in that. We're not really, we're having to become that. But I guess we ought to start with when you say trauma, is there a working definition or is it so broad you can't get our mind around it? What's the deal?
Yeah, there's a lot of different definitions. A lot of times we think of trauma being an event, like the pandemic happened, right? It was an
Right.
event that we experienced. And then how did it affect us? Because then there's some people who they may have experienced some type of abuse growing up, and it continues to have a very strong effect on them. And then there's others who may have experienced a similar type of abuse, but they would say, yeah, it doesn't really affect me, and I'm functional in my day to day life and doing fairly healthy. So there's this idea that trauma often is an experience, but it's something that continues to have an effect on us beyond that experience. So if somebody experiences physical abuse as a kid, we're going to continue to see this type of trauma having an effect on them as they move forward into their life, like present day.
Wow, that covers a lot of areas. It's more than just the event itself. There's some longevity in the stuff that goes with it. So,
Yes.
what would be? I don't know. You may want to cover this. So, just free spin here a little bit on
Okay.
anything you think church leaders in particular. Why is it important for church leaders today? I mean,
Ah,
10 years
yeah.
ago, the word wasn't even in our vocabulary.
Hmm.
So, talk about that
Yeah.
a bit.
Okay. So when it comes to trauma, and especially for your congregations, like I was working at that psychiatric hospital, and there were some people in particular who, like, they weren't Christian and they weren't really seeking Christ, but you could tell that they just lacked any sort of healthy support and that they were in such need of community and of people to really help guide them. Like, it was very evident that they needed Jesus. They needed psychiatric help too, with medicines, with therapy, and they needed help resolving their trauma. And so there was one client in particular, I remember thinking, like, she is in such a bad state. And the way that she's dealing with her trauma leaves her in such a bad state. Like, what would it be like if she showed up to church? Like, how would she be received? And that's something then that very much is up to the church congregation, for the leaders, for the ministers to be able to say, like, yeah, when someone shows up and trauma is continuing to perpetuate on them in ways that it's continuing to really have negative effects, like, how do we as Jesus followers, like, show up with them and for them? Trauma is very disconnecting. It disconnects the person often from a sense of community or from loved ones. It may even disconnect them from themselves. And we may talk a little bit about that later. And so if they can show up in a place where they're going to have a sense of community that says, like, even though there's this thing that's continuing to have an effect on you, like, we're going to love you and encourage you and support you and practice some grace and understanding with the way you're trying to manage these struggles, because that's what's going to allow that person to really move towards being open to Jesus and being open to a community of healing. And so it's going to be important for church leaders to understand what trauma is, what it looks like. And so let me go ahead and talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, do it.
Uh,
That's great.
because, like, trauma, a lot of times we do think of it as an event, and it could be something like any type of abuse, whether that's physical abuse, whether that's emotional or verbal abuse, sexual abuse. It could be bullying, whether that happened at school, whether it happened at home or in the neighborhood, whether it happens at work in their adult life, or any type of neglect where they have a need that just continually goes unmet.
Hmm.
It could be abandonment. A parent just ups and leaves one day, or a partner just ups and leaves one day. And a lot of times it's whatever's going on with that parent, whatever's going on with that partner is what led them to leave. But especially for like the child who goes, was I not worth the time? Was I not worth the energy? Was I not worth their love? And so the child often takes it very personally, even though it's not about the child. It never is, but it leaves them with this wound that says, I must not be enough. I
Mm.
must not be lovable. And so it could be any type of activity like that, anything like that. It could be an accident, whether it's something that happened to them or they witnessed happening to someone else. It could be a disaster, fire, flood, tornado, and it could be the loss of some kind. So, like the loss of a loved one, especially if that death is very sudden and unexpected. It can feel very traumatic. The way the death came about could feel very traumatic.
Yes.
A divorce, whether it's theirs or their parents, or even the loss of a dream. And so, like, Grady, when you hear loss of a dream, what do you think of? What comes to mind?
I immediately associate that with some form of helplessness and loss of purpose.
Yes, yeah. So, like, life is going to look a certain way, right? I have this dream that I'm going to accomplish this job, I'm going to have this career, I'm going to have this family. So I think of like the young athlete who's been training and training and they're about to go to college or they're about to go pro, and then they get that injury. And suddenly they go, yeah, not going to be playing that sport anymore.
That's
Well,
right.
now what do I do? What's my purpose? Well, I'm going to grow up and I may have come from a broken family, but I'm going to get married and we're going to have kids and we're going to grow old and we'll have grandkids. And then something happens to that relationship. And not only is there the pain and possible trauma of the loss of that relationship, but the loss of this dream of having like a whole and connected family.
Mm, mm. You make me think of, since I'm a minister and I spent my life in ministry, yeah, I guess spiritual abuse is a very specific kind of abuse.
It is.
And there's churches that can, if the churches can be a healing presence or a judgmental presence that keeps people. And so when I think of
Yeah.
healing, a healing presence, how does a church respond? Spiritual abuse could be manipulation, coercive, judgmentalism. I don't know.
Yes.
Am I on the right track with spiritual
Yeah.
abuse? Yeah.
You are, and that's something that lately I've come across like three different books on that, but I haven't had a chance to read them yet, so I don't know to recommend them or not. But that is like an up and coming topic that's being looked at more, where how do church leaders engage with their community, and how does that affect the members? Because there are a lot of people that say, I felt like I was controlled by a leader. I felt like maybe they used their authority or they used God as a form of control. And whenever we're being controlled, rarely does it leave us feeling good.
That's
It
right.
takes a sense of autonomy away from us. And when we feel that kind of then helpless feeling, well, I guess I have to do this because this is what they say. Uh, it doesn't lead to health and wellness. It doesn't lead to healthy relationships. And you can imagine that being like in a controlling relationship where maybe one of the partners is very domineering. They have a lot of control over their partner. They will act out in certain ways that tends to then influence the partner significantly. And so then we look at certain congregations and like, well, how dogmatic are they?
Oh,
How
that's a biggie.
hung up are they on legalism and doing these things exactly right or perfect? And if it's not, then what's wrong? And it leaves that person often feeling unsafe at church.
Yeah, and
I
then
can't let the church
yeah,
leadership see me. I can't let them know this about me or the struggle that I'm having.
yeah, and sometimes I call it, especially those in authority in churches, or those that are leading churches, those that, well, the buck stops with the elder, the buck stops with the minister, or in some churches, the pastor. And so
Yeah.
I sometimes think it's easy to
Yeah.
play the God card. Here's what the Bible says. And if you don't do this, you're not pleasing God. That's manipulation. That's coercive. That borders on spiritual abuse.
Yes, yes, it does.
Uh,
And that's why there's a lot of people who aren't comfortable setting foot in churches and opening up to church leadership or talking with ministers because they've experienced that at some point in their past. And so then they start to seek other ways of finding some sense of grander fulfillment or understanding of life in the world because it just felt scary, it felt controlling, or it even felt damaging. Um,
so once
and
once you
go
start
ahead.
working with someone that's not just spiritual abuse, but in your field, when you're working with abuse of any kind, what are the kind of the I mean, we're not talking about we're going to meet for three sessions and you're going to be well, you know.
Right.
So
Yeah.
talk to me about the process, the
Yeah.
what do you do? How do people begin to take the journey toward health if they're experiencing any kind of abuse?
Yeah. So first of all, it starts with getting away from the abuse if it's currently happening.
Okay.
So are you going to be safe in the present moment? Because counseling and any sort of coping skills or other things like they're not going to help that much if the person's still going home to the abuser, if they're still showing up and being manipulated and controlled by the abuser in church situations, right?
Right.
So first of all, it's are you safe today? Are you away from the person or situation that seems to be causing the harm? Once that's the case, then it's let's teach some coping skills to help you figure out how to help manage what your body is experiencing. So there's two different quotes from authors that have come to mind. One is from Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. He wrote a book, The Body Keeps the Score,
And I love
right?
that book. That is on my shelf right near me.
And it is long, it is a bit sciencey in ways, but I think that's the kind of book where just about everybody needs to read it.
I totally
Um,
agree.
so ministers, elders, like understanding how the body keeps the score is going to be important. And so what he notes from the book is that when we experience this kind of unpleasant situation, this trauma, whatever it may be, it ends and then it's over. But then what we have found is that the body then often continues to perpetuate the idea of that experience, almost like I'm safe now, but I still don't get to feel safe. And so I have to stay guarded, I have to stay reactive, I have to do something to try to keep myself on the go so that I can get to a safe space, not realizing I'm already safe. So a lot of times there's this reactivity that continues to occur even once they're removed from the situation. So then that's where me as the therapist says, let's teach some coping skills so that way we can then better start to address this pain and this trauma. Another quote from Jamie Finn, the author of Foster the Family, which is a lot about foster care. Um, is she says trauma is what happens when our bodies react to suffering that they weren't created to experience. And so the person's body often continues to react to this trauma, even if that trauma is decades old. And like the person may sit with me and go, yeah, I know this happened 17 years ago. But when I start to talk about it or think about it, I still get this heaviness in my chest or this tightness in my stomach, or I just want to like run and get away, where I don't want to have to feel this or deal with this anymore. And so that's one thing that I think the church and that ministry leaders need to understand is that even after the harmful experience has come to an end, the person is often going to continue to experience symptoms related to it years, if not decades later, if it doesn't get treated.
Wow,
So,
you go ahead.
well, and I was going to say, a lot of times I'll ask clients and we'll talk about like, well, so what happens if we get a physical wound? Like I get a gash across my hand. Well, if I don't do anything about it, it's going to get infected. And if I don't do anything about that infection, it's going to go to gangrene, sepsis, something pretty serious, which is why we know, yeah, you get a cut on your hand, you got to treat it. But then when it comes to our emotional wounds, well, what were you taught about healing emotional wounds? And the clients say, don't feel it, don't cry, don't you dare show weakness through tears. Well, there's nothing to be done about it now. We don't talk about that kind of stuff. Let's just sweep that under the rug, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You got to move on. And that's what we've got to do. So a lot of times the work that they do with me, but the work that could also occur with ministry leaders is naming trauma,
Oh,
naming that it's a thing that happens. And that while the minister may not be equipped to really help do the healing work with the person, they can show up as a significant support person that is safe for them to be around, that's safe for them to talk about their thoughts and their feelings, so that not only do they have a therapist to go to, but now they have some additional support that says it's okay to name these things that you're dealing with and the way that you've tried to cope and to manage them. Yeah.
that makes me think of an old book, How to Talk So Children Will Listen, and how to
Mm,
listen so children would talk. It's several years old, but my wife
yeah.
did it years ago. And the key thing of it is identifying emotion.
Yes.
It is giving it a name, naming it. So if the your daughter comes home from school and she's been hurt by a friend, well, talk to me about that. Well,
Yes.
it sure sounds like that hurts your feelings. Is that right? Yes, it hurt my feeling. So the
Yes.
mother's naming it. That was so helpful. But oftentimes in church, we just talk about, well, that's hard. God's with you. It'll be okay. You
Right.
times. The
Yeah.
other dynamic I'd like for you to speak to is, as a preacher, we're taught, all right, the Bible says, so Matthew 18 says, if you have a problem with somebody, go to them. Recently, I was dealing in a situation to where there was some deep spiritual abuse. And this person said, they never came to me. So I talked to the other person that was abused, and they said, I'm still scared. I'm not ready to go to that person. I,
Right.
I don't feel safe.
Yeah.
So
So what's
that person pulled
interesting,
the God card and said, but Matthew 18 says,
right? Let me control you some more through the Bible,
hi, I love that. Yeah, it's sad, but
right?
it's true. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's like if Grady, you took a turn for the worse and you stabbed me, and then somebody's like, "Well, Landon, you need to go talk to Grady about how he stabbed you." Like, no, I'm not getting close to Grady. He stabbed me,
Oh, yeah, that's really
right?
true.
And what we've learned over the last 5 or so years from different like brain scans and body scans is that the brain and the body processes emotional threats the same way as physical threats.
Oh, that's big right there.
And so, well, what did they do? Well, they just verbally berated me. Well, it's not like they stabbed you. Yeah, but my brain and my body responded to that verbal berating as if it was a stab wound. So please don't ask me to go talk to this person who I'm still scared of because it doesn't feel safe. And when you then use something like Matthew 18 to coerce somebody to go into an unsafe situation, you are not being a safe person. And that is not going to lead them towards healing.
Wow, that's really significant because I think you can get. I'm a little scared to say this, but I'll just say it. Sometimes us church people can get seduced by the Bible to the neglect of caring for the person.
Yeah.
What do you hear me saying in that? Can you help me unpack that if you agree with that?
Yeah. So what comes to mind for me with that is that because we often don't recognize how to handle hurt because we were not trained how to deal with our own hurt, we then just turn to the Bible, which is a very oftentimes intellectual exercise. Well, here's a thought and here's an action. Okay, well, what does that mean we do about emotion, though? Well, I mean, emotions are like of the heart, and the Bible says not to trust your heart, so we don't really deal too much with emotion. Be angry, but sin not. So, whatever that means, just be careful. A
Yeah.
lot of times, we need to be able to say, here's what it means to feel anger, and how to name and express that anger, and what it means to be able to work through the anger without sinning. There was a client once in a group session and he talked about being angry. And I was like, well, can you tell me about that anger? And he said, I don't really think you want me to. And I was like, well, yeah, please do. And then he went on this little tirade, calling his soon to be ex wife all sorts of really ugly names. And so after a moment, I was kind of like, oh, okay. So I just witnessed your anger as you went on this expletive filled, rant about your soon to be ex. But can you tell me about this anger that you feel in your body? Like all of these words that were coming out, where do you feel that energy inside of you? And he looked at his hands that were fists and he's like, well, in my hands, in my fists, that's where I'm feeling this energy. And I was like, okay, talk to me about that. And so then I was teaching him like a lot of times anger, sadness, whatever the emotion is, we often have some sort of body connection to it, even though we may not have been taught how to notice that. So as we start to get in tune with our emotions, we start to notice where we carry them in our body, whether it's in this energy of my fists or this tightness in my chest or this tension in my shoulders or like a flightiness in my head. And church leaders need to be able to recognize like how can we start identifying emotions and helping recognize where we feel them in our body.
Oh, that's big. And, it's interesting, and maybe I'm off base here, but I've often encouraged people to spend time in the Psalms because the Psalms are so emotive, and
Yes.
they're just pouring
Yeah.
their heart out to God, and it's not
Mhm.
always clean and neat, especially the laments, the penitential Psalms,
Yes.
even Psalms of vengeance, which doesn't sound like a Christian ought to do, but it's there
They're there,
for a
right?
season. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
what do we
Yeah.
do about, okay, so first of all, remove yourself from the situation, become
Yes.
aware of the emotional stuff. So,
Hmm.
what are some other steps that, you know, just an average church leader, whatever that means, average,
Yeah.
uh, what do we need to do? I mean, what are some recognition, some awareness, some
Okay.
understanding? Go ahead.
Yeah. So there's two things that come to mind, and it's about how we tend to react with our behaviors. Um, and on the one side, there's our automatic nervous system. And whenever we feel in danger, our automatic nervous system is going to respond. And it has this tendency to respond with either I need to fight to protect myself,
Yeah.
I need to flee to get away, I need to freeze because I don't know what to do. So I'm just going to go deer in the headlights and hopefully the danger will pass. And then lately, they've been discovering a fourth one that they call fawn. And really, it just means appease. I'm going to go into this like people pleasing mode because if I can pacify the abuser, then maybe I won't get beat tonight. So fight, flight, freeze, and appease. And that is a part of our automatic nervous system. And the only thing that's really going to help us to start working through that is by taking good, slow, deep breaths. So if they can say, I'm here, I'm here to listen, but also let's just do some good, deep breathing as a part of that. That's often going to help the nervous system side of it. Then on the other side, we have like historical patterns. Like, what did I witness growing up? Was one of the parents loud and aggressive? Was one of them much more passive? And what did I witness and what did I learn? And what habits did I develop about how I tend to handle my emotions, my thoughts, my feelings? And those patterns are often almost based, it seems, on like scarcity. I'm not going to have enough money. Am I going to be loved? Am I going to have enough resources? Am I good enough? And then it tends to follow those same kind of patterns of fight, flight, freeze, and appease. So that if we recognize somebody seems to be struggling with anger and we go, whoa, well, be angry and sin not. Okay, well, can I recognize that their anger often is about, I have to hurt you before you have the chance to hurt me because I have to protect myself because I'm never going to let myself be hurt the way I was ever again. Okay, well, what does assertiveness look like where we go, like, you get to express yourself, but here's how to respect yourself and respect others. So they move from this kind of aggressive behavior to let's take some breaths and figure out how you can be assertive so that you still get to be heard, but we're not going to be lashing out at others. The flight behavior is about escaping and numbing. You know, I could be literally running away from the danger, but then other times it's just, I don't like what I'm feeling. So what can I do to stop feeling this? And that's where alcohol, where drugs, where pornography, gambling, social media scrolling for hours on end,
Eating.
just eating, being a workaholic, as long as I stay so busy.
Oh,
And that's
you're getting a
and
little
that's what,
personal there, that workaholic stuff. Come on now.
yeah. And even some of it sounds really Christian, like, well, I'm going to spend so much time and energy taking care of others. I'm doing good work, but I'm doing it at the expense of myself. But as long as I stay busy enough taking care of everybody and everything, I don't have to deal with my own issues.
Yeah,
And
and
so it's distraction. Yeah.
now churches tend, it's a broad statement, but we have a lot of, in the name of following Jesus, we have a lot of rescuers.
So many.
We cannot
Yes.
we cannot just say, all right, that's their issue. They're working through that. I can't
Yeah.
rescue it. I can't fix it. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah. What else is practical as we kind of wrap up the next 2 or 3 minutes
Okay.
or
So
resource?
then this flight, the freeze, a lot of times it's shutting down, staying so busy, or I'm going to look depressed, I'm going to look inactive. Well, how can we help them to slow down if they're staying too busy to start to get in touch? If they're shut down, how can we invite them to be present? Conversation, a hug, if that's appropriate, whatever it may be, to say, like, you get to have your space, but we also want you to be present here in this safe space. And that last one, the appease, it's, I will ignore myself and just pour into others. Okay, well, even Jesus went to pray alone. And the apostles were looking for him. Jesus, where have you been? We're looking for you. Yeah, I know you have been, but I needed some time to go and pray and connect with God for me so I can continue to show up and be here. So
Wow.
teaching people, like, we've got to take care of ourselves and God intends for us to take care of ourselves. And once we're well, then God will continue to, like, empower us to share our time and our energy, but not at the expense of ourselves completely.
So what would be, do you have a resource that's accessible to something you suggest for church leaders that is not so
Yes.
clinical that we have to look up words every 3 minutes?
Yes, indeed. So the first several books I've got, Hurting with God by Glenn Pemberton.
Oh, I love that book.
Very good. Then Emotionally Healthy Leadership by Pete Scazzaro. His
Excellent.
book, his podcasts, very good resources for ministry leaders. Managing Leadership Anxiety by Steve Cuss, and Wholeheartedness by Chuck DeGroat.
I
All
know.
of those are
Yeah,
very good books that are
I've
going to
heard
help.
I've heard of
Uh,
Chuck, but I've not read Chuck's. But
yeah.
they having Steve Cuss for some Hope Network stuff in January.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome.
Very exciting.
You this
And
Go ahead.
I was going to say, and there's one podcast called The Place We Find Ourselves by Adam Young. Adam, he is a therapist. He also has his Master's of Divinity. And so he has the therapy component and the theological component that he often draws in together. So he has several episodes where he interviews people, where they talk about their story, and he has many episodes where he will educate on why our story matters and how God uses that and helps us move towards healing. And so it ends up being a very good resource as well.
Well, we will include these books in when we put it in our Link with Hope network, and in a
All
couple
right.
3 weeks, we'll include those books in the resource. And in the meantime, you live in Memphis, Bartlett, Tennessee. So if
Yes.
somebody said, "I've got a question, I want to email you," how would they do that?
They can use my work email, Landon, Landon,
Okay.
at Bartlett Christian Counseling. Bartlett is BARTLETT, ChristianCounseling.com. And so Landon at BartlettChristianCounseling.com. Let me know if you have questions, and I'll get back with you as I can, pointing you in some directions for possible resources, and we can go from there.
That's great. I want to thank you for joining us
Yeah.
with this Hope Network webinar on what church leaders need to know about trauma. Maybe we can do another one in a few months and keep building on this. This has been so helpful. It's always good to see you, and I'm thankful for the ministry that you do. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Grady. Very welcome.